Physical. Well, it is continuous application of energy towards a goal or purpose. Because of this purposive nature of work, it is inseparable from religion, and yet historically it has often been divorced from it. Van der Lauw's study of religion in essence and manifestation, a phenomenological study, has much to say on festivals and rites surrounding work, but nothing on work as such. The same is true of Hastings' Encyclopedia of Religion and Ethics. Biblical dictionaries rarely say much on the subject, since, all too often, their perspective is Neoplatonist, Arminian, or modernist. Outside the biblical tradition, that is, the Christian and Jewish world, work has been something despised, done only out of necessity, and regarded as the province of slaves. In many cultures, mental work has been the duty of underlings and slaves. Arabic science waned and disappeared when Christian slaves and their children no longer provided a captive group of intellectuals. In Babylon, the wise men, as the book of Daniel gives us evidence of, were commonly the captive elites of conquered aristocracies. The Babylonians themselves preferred to exercise power rather than intellect. The Turkish Empire rested on slave labour, conquered people as its bureaucracy and builders, and a levy of boys for its elite groups, the Janissaries. I knew that word. The Janissaries. In the modern world, examples of the same contempt for work are many. Ethiopia is nominally Christian, but its people have little knowledge of the meaning of the faith. Among the elite Amharic people, O'Callaghan reported in 1961 that many parents still regarded it as a disgrace for a daughter to become a typist or a nurse, but thought nothing of a apprenticing them to a brothel at the age of 13 or 14. Quote, the custom is traditional with both men and women of Amhara that they will never do any work that involves using their hands. That is why there are still so few Amhara doctors, nurses, typists, or shopkeepers in Ethiopia. End quote. Government jobs are preferred by the men, and prostitution is the route for the women. Prostitution is not seen as a disgrace, not a bar to marriage when the girl reaches 21 and is too old for the brothel. She has, after all, been a, quote, lady, end quote, and commanded a slave or two. Black slaves, of course. The same is true of the Arab. Quote, he is a proud man, too proud to do any menial work. From time immemorial, there were slaves for that type of work, and as long as the Arab has money to buy them, he will do so. End quote. A similar attitude prevails among African Negros, for, although the African male... There's a quote somewhere, and I don't know where it is. You see, it's confusing. Quote, no, I see the problem. I see what it is. A similar attitude prevails for A similar attitude prevails among African Negros, for, quote, although the African male is attached to the soil, he does nothing to cultivate it. This is left to the women and children. They are beasts of burden, the motor power for all agricultural operations. Women in African tribes are treated as little better than cattle. Indeed, in some tribes, like the Mash, the cattle are considered more valuable. End quote. O'Callaghan noted further, quote, it is thought that when some of the Africans became detribalized, this practice would cease, and they would adopt the white man's ways when they moved to the cities. Instead, the position became worse. They got jobs as taxi drivers, or in garages, or as houseboys, and probably for the first time owned some money. Saving this, the African went back to his tribe and with it bought a wife. He brought her to the city, installed her in his shack and rented her out to his friends who could not afford a wife. Soon he had money to buy another wife, which he duly did. He rented her out and brought a third. In the course of a few years, he had acquired 9 or 10 wives, all of whom were earning him a steady income. I know several taxi drivers in Nairobi who have several wives acquired in this way. They say proudly that there is now no need for them to work, but the taxis are useful for ferrying clients from the centre of Nairobi to the brothel districts of Eastleigh. End quote. The modern liberal is very fond of idealizing the various backward peoples of the world, and he consistently portrays the Christian as the despoiler and the ravager of the simple paradise of quote-unquote primitive cultures. Our concern here is not with the sexual and other depravities of these cultures, but simply their attitude towards work. It needs to be said, however, that the various idealizations of these backward cultures are works of fiction. The often idealized Tuaregs of North Africa, who still regard themselves as a white race, leave all their work to their slaves, the Bella people. Quote, these Bella, men, women and children, belong to their master's body and soul. I have lived in these Tuareg camps, and I have seen these slave girls and slave women working from dawn until dusk. I should explain that among the Tuareg women, fatness is considered a sign of great beauty, and so the Tuareg women are not allowed to do any work, even if they want to. So there they lay, rather like sea lions in the zoo after feeding time, watching their slaves from behind the fields of their indigo veils. Fields? Folds. Well, it could be fields, since they're so big. Har, har, har. Watching their slaves from behind the folds of their indigo veils, and doing nothing. Moreover, the Tuareg caste of nobles refer to and think of themselves as nobles, and nobles do not work. Nobles in the Sahara, I mean. Nobles in the Sahara, I mean to say. No, Tuareg noble. No Tuareg noble. No Tuareg noble. No Tuareg noble would think of handling a spade, erecting a tent, or carrying a gourd of water, and so they have these great herds of slaves, exactly as they have always had great herds of sheep, and in the great wastes of the Sahara, they have been able to preserve this institution of slavery some 65 years after the French occupation put an end to slavery. I have lived in these camps and seen these little skinny boys with bellies horribly distended from malnutrition going out in the morning before dawn with the herds, and I have known that until they came back in the evening, they would be in the desert without anything to eat or drink. And when they got back after the Tuareg nobles had eaten and after their wives had had their ration of milk, if there was anything left, they would get it. I have seen the marks of cruelty on their bodies. If they were disobedient, or if they lose an animal by neglect, they are tied to a tree and lashed until they lose consciousness, and sometimes they do not recover and are just left to die. End quote. The goal of life in non-Christian societies is to reach a position in life where work is unnecessary and where others can be commanded to work for you. With the departure of Western man from the faith, a similar attitude is developed among Westerners. The goal of life becomes vacations and retirement for all too many. The result of any such view over a span of time is a decline of productivity, a collapse in the standard of living, and an erosion of moral character. The attitude of the Hebrews, still surviving to a degree among many Jews, was that a man who did not teach his child 2 things, the law of God and how to work a trade, taught him to be a thief because of his neglect. Because of a like grounding in the law of God, the Puritans held to this same standard. Quote, a parent had to provide for his children because they were unable to provide for themselves. If he was ever to free himself of the obligation, he must see to it that they knew how to earn a living. Quote, if you're careful to bring them up diligently in proper business, end quote, Benjamin Wadsworth advised parents, quote, you take a good method for their comfortable subsistence in the world and for their being serviceable in their generation, you do better for them than if you should bring them up idly and yet leave them great estates. End quote. According to law, every father had to see that his children were instructed, quote, in some honest lawful calling, labour or employment, either in husbandry or some other trade profitable for themselves and the Commonwealth, if they will not or cannot train them up in learning to fit them for higher improvements. End quote. The goal in rearing children was how to make them, quote, serviceable in their generation. End quote. Work was not the duty of slaves, but the calling of God's elect. It is not surprising that slavery soon disappeared from New England and from other areas affected by Puritanism. As Puritanism moved south after 1770, it created an anti-slavery element in the South whose strength and influence has never been sufficiently appreciated. The Puritan standard thus represented a break with the Cavalier and aristocratic tradition, which meant that, instead of work, idleness was now the evil. Puritan boys and girls were routinely placed in other homes as a part of their education. This was something more than the old apprenticeship idea, for it was done when there was educational advantage, and it was done with girls as well as boys. Morgan's comments on this are excellent. The parents knew how great their love for their children was and how easy it is to indulge one's child. They held that a child learned better manners and work habits in another home than his own. Taking seriously God's law that an incorrigibly disobedient or delinquent child deserves death, they took pains to avoid fostering an ill-mannered and undisciplined child. It is not at all surprising that the Puritan culture is spoken of today as a work ethic, as production-oriented rather than consumption-governed. In terms of the modern mentality, it has become the mark of the new elite to be given to conspicuous consumption, to spend money casually and freely, to use and discard styles and possessions quickly and carelessly. This has also become a middle-class goal. As Bell commented, quote, if, quote, conspicuous consumption, end quote, was the badge of a rising middle class, quote, conspicuous loafing, end quote, is the hostile gesture of a tired working class. In many machine plants, as sociologist Donald Roy describes it, workers play the, quote, make-out, end quote, game, that is, working at a breakneck pace to fulfill one's piecework quota so that one can be free for the rest of the day, end quote. There is a marked flight from work. Work is seen as a curse, and idleness as a blessing, a goal to be attained and a state of bliss. Men work in order to be free from work and to be idle. Idleness is seen as a reward for and deliverance from work. To cite again Bell's perspective analysis, quote, perceptive calafulo. To cite again Bell's perceptive. To cite again Bell's perceptive analysis, quote, the most significant form taken by the flight from work is the desperate drive for, quote, leisure, end quote. Work is irksome, but if it cannot be evaded, it can be reduced. In modern times, the ideal is to minimize the unpleasant aspects of work as much as possible by pleasant distractions, music, wall colors, rest periods, and to hasten away as quickly as possible, uncontaminated by work and unimpaired by arduousness. A gleaming two-page advertisement. A gleaming two-page advertisement in Life magazine shows a beautiful Lincoln car in the patio living room of an elegantly simple house, and the ad proclaims, quote, your home has a walls... Your home has walls of glass. Your kitchen is an engineering miracle. Your clothes and your furniture are beautifully functional. You work easily, play hard. End quote. The themes of play, of recreation, of amusement are the dominant ones in our culture today. They are the subject of the, quote, hard sell, end quote. Sports clothes, travel, the outdoor barbecue, the portable TV set all become the hallmarks of the time. In this passivity, there are already the seeds of decay. End quote. The reward for work is dominion and achievement. To tell men that the reward for work is leisure or idleness is the same as saying that the reward for sex is castration. The purpose of rest is not escape from work, but a rest in the Lord and a refreshing before return to work. Today, in both the Western nations and the Marxist states, work is increasingly seen as a burden and a curse. The greater the departure from Christian faith and a free economy, the greater the flight from work and the less the dominion exercised by man. However comfortable his circumstances, leisured man is still a slave. He is an heir of the bread and circus mobs of Rome. Ironically, however, both under capitalism and socialism, work has been held out as a great ideal and as man's hope. Lenin, for example, believed intensely in the necessity for work, and he was profoundly influenced by the American assembly line and by the efficiency expert Frederick W. Taylor. In June of 1919, he introduced piecework and Taylorism into the Soviet Union, stating, quote, "The possibility of socialism will be determined by our success in combining Soviet rule and Soviet organization or management with the latest progressive measures of capitalism. We must introduce in Russia the study and teaching of the Taylor system and its systematic trial and adoption." End quote. For Marxists and capitalists alike, work rather than Jesus Christ has become the means of salvation. This was very clearly in evidence in Henry Ford's My Philosophy of Industry. Ford was essentially a, quote, funny money, end quote, man. He also believed in status industries and public works to relieve unemployment. Religiously, his position was pragmatism. Religiously, his position was pragmatism. Quote, "We know when we have reached truth, we are on the right road towards We are on the right road to truth when the things that we are doing make men a little freer than they are. We may also know when we are on the right road by examining what our motives are." End quote. This is self-righteousness as well as pragmatism. Moreover, quote, "Morality is merely doing the sound thing in the best way." End quote. Ford's vision of the future was summed up in a chapter heading, quote, "Machinery, the new Messiah." End quote. Because of mechanization, individual farms would be replaced by corporate farms. Men will, by mental powers newly developed, communicate with other planners and will perhaps visit them. In every area of life, the machine will give man dominion and salvation. Quote, "Machinery is accomplishing in the world what man has failed to do by preaching propaganda or the written word. The airplane and radio know no boundary. They pass over the dotted lines on the map without heed or hindrance. They are binding the world together in a way no other system can. The motion picture with its universal language, the airplane with its speed, and the radio with its coming international program, these will soon bring the whole world to a complete understanding. Thus may we vision a United States of the world. Ultimately, it would... what a fool. Ultimately, it will surely come." End quote. In the 1920s, the men who worked for Ford were farm folk and immigrants. They were work-oriented and simple, trusting Christians. The machine and the assembly line were to them things of beauty, and they talk freely of the increased, quote, horsepower, end quote, the machine provided. I recall vividly as a boy in Detroit during most of the 1920s hearing workers talk with pride of their work and enlarge with voices filled with awe on what the machine enabled man to do in the way of more work. But these workers, for these workers, it was a status symbol to be a man engaged in a work which was changing the world. Today, while we can agree with Crystal that talk of alienated workers is nonsense and, quote, baited neo-Marxism, end quote, it is still true that, for most workers, it's a job. The old zeal for work is gone. The reason is religious. They'll recognize the link between biblical faith and work. Secular thinkers like Tolstoy and A.D. Gordon could preach about salvation through work, but if life is meaningless, work is also meaningless. Freud saw work as the chief means of binding an individual to reality, but if a man finds reality unpleasant, he will run from it into liquor, leisure, drugs, or some other means of escape. As Bell noted for the Protestant reformers, quote, all work was endowed with virtue, end quote. Luther said that, quote, a housemaid who does her work is no farther away from God than the priest in his pulpit, end quote. Whereas Zwingli and Calvin, quote, work was connected with the joy of creating and with exploring even the wonders of creation, end quote. Now, with the loss of faith, dominion is replaced by domination and work by leisure. As Bell stated, quote, in the last century or more, with the decline of religious faith, this belief in death as total annihilation has probably increased. One may argue, parenthetically, that here is a case of the breakthrough of the irrational, which is such a marked feature of the changed moral temper of our times. Fanaticism, violence, and cruelty are not, of course, unique in human history, but such frenzies and mass emotions were displaced, symbolized, drained away, and dispersed through the religious sphere. But now there is only this life, and with it the realization that domination on earth means an assertion of self. One can challenge death by emphasizing the omnipotence of a movement like the, quote, inevitable, end quote, victory of communism, or overcome death like the, quote, immortality, end quote, of Captain Ahab through the triumphal domination over others. The modern effort to transform the world solely or chiefly through politics, rather than the transformation of the self, has meant that all other institutional ways of mobilizing emotional energy would necessarily atrophy. In effect, sect and church became party and social movement. End quote. Bell's point is excellent. Irrationalism and violence are especially potent forces in our time and have appeared where they should at least have appeared where they should least appear. And have appeared where they should least appear, in student circles and in the middle-class youth. Precisely because meaninglessness and irrationalism have captured these areas, what was once the province of reason has become the domain of unreason. With the enthronement of a faith in universal meaninglessness, the standard of work and dominion has been replaced by the new standard, leisure and domination. The goal now is to dominate over others, often with brutality and murder. The standard in family relations is the same, domination. The old-fashioned father of some years ago exercised far more authority and Okay. The old-fashioned father of some years ago exercised far more authority and dominion than the father of today, but he was not domineering. His dominion was protective, not oppressive. Similarly, the state has moved from a protective to an oppressive role. Capitalists and Marxists alike begin by seeing work as a means of redemption and have alike problems now with a generation given to violence and idleness. This transition is not new. The family of Cain began by trying through work to recreate paradise. They worked to build a walled city and to develop arts and crafts, Genesis 4:16-26, but they also, at the same time, developed the strain of violence. Violence replaces work over and over again in history as a means of attaining one's goals. The consequence is a drift into the politics of violence. Socialism. St. Paul made clear the standard for Christians in writing to the Thessalonians, quote, "But we charge you, brothers, in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, to withdraw from every brother who, instead of observing the instruction you received from us, is walking out of step. For you know yourselves how you should follow us, because we don't because we did not live neglectful of duty among you, neither did we eat anyone's food without pay. Instead, we did hard and heavy work night and day, so as not to impose on any of you. Not that we did not have the right to it, but to furnish you ourselves as an example which you should follow. For while we were with you, we gave you this charge, quote, if anyone does not want to work, then he should not eat either." End quote. We were hearing, however, that some of you live neglectful of your duty, not busily working, but busy in other folks' affairs. Such persons we direct and charge in the Lord Jesus Christ that, doing their work quietly, they eat their own food. 2 Thessalonians 3:6-12, Berkeley version. In a Greek city, St. Paul set an example of a new way of life. He worked with his hands and worked with his mind as their teacher. This he did both to gain an independence from them and also, as he stated, to furnish them with an example to follow. Greek culture was not given to an appreciation of work. Even mental work was treated as a hobby by some, not as work. Failure to work, St. Paul termed, quote, walking out of step, end quote, or walking in a, quote, disorderly, end quote, manner. The Christian has a goal, and his life is a, quote, continuous application of energy towards an end, end quote, and this is dominion of which work is a part. Wasn't the best ending. Not gonna killed whenever it was. Oh, what's that click? Dude. Anyway, hope you're all well. That was work. Another stellar and spectacular chapter. Not from the narrator, but from the author. Whoa, it's so great to have work, isn't it? Fantastic. All right, guys. Hope to see you in the next chapter. L-I-I-I. Justice. See you soon.